Welcome to Chicago Politics in Transition, a forum focused on hearing from a diverse group of political science experts on the ever-changing and challenging political dynamics in Chicago and what led to the first mayoral runoff in the history of Chicago. I'm Susan Garrett, and I chair the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, or as we call it, ICPR. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works 24/7 to promote high ethical standards, transparency, and accountability in government. We also, thanks, Chris. We need a little cheering. We also offer forums like the one we are hosting today on a multitude of relevant topics. Thanks to our scholarship program, we always invite students from local colleges and universities to attend our events and forums. Today, students from DePaul University, Columbia College, and members of the Illinois Women's Institute for Leadership are here as our guests. We have included envelopes at your tables with the opportunity to sponsor students to attend these types of programs in the future. We thank you in advance for your support. If you decide to make a contribution, you could give the envelope to Sarah Bruni, our Deputy Director, there she is, or just mail it in. Before we get started, I want to thank the panelists for their participation in today's event, the Union League Club for their support, and the staff of both ICPR and the Union League Club for their expertise and service. Please feel free to begin eating, and Chris Roebling, as you've already met him, will moderate today's discussion. Chris is the principal of Clearspan Strategic LLC, a PR and communications firm in Chicago, and if you look at your program, you can see he's been everywhere, and he does everything, he knows everybody. We hope you enjoy today's discussion, and here's Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, Susan. Good to have you. Hey, everybody. Well, it was, as we used to say, we had an election this week. Who won, who lost, and why? And that's what we're going to get to. I think we've got a tremendous panel, as you can see. I feel like I'm back at, mentioning Jackie again, I feel like I'm back at WBEZ doing a program on school reform in the early 1990s when we had panels of this size. So we've got perspectives on the results, we've got some perspectives on turnout, and then a little bit about the runoff, the projections that were made. We want to talk in terms of the polling that was done, and then the results that we actually saw. So that's a fourth part of the program. And then we're going to get to the campaign trends at the mayoral and at the aldermanic levels. And after all of that, we'll have time for a little bit of conversation. So let me adopt Paul's mantra. I'm just going to introduce our folks because there is a terrific write-up in your program about everybody from whom you will be hearing. So let's get started for about 5 minutes with Jim Dispenza, the co-founder and data editor of AlderTrack. Jim.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
AlderTrack is a new daily Insider Chicago Politics email newsletter that's just starting out. Since October, we've been focused very intensely on the aldermanic elections. And if I were to provide several perspectives on the runoffs, I think what we found out was that Mayor Emanuel is just about as progressive as the electorate wants him to be, that city council is not nearly as independent from the mayor as the electorate wants it to be. I thought we saw some the interesting sort of emergence of some of the national Democratic progressive left groups like United Working Families and Reclaim Chicago. I think they're right when they say they intend to be a force, to be reckoned with throughout, not just the campaign season, but all year long and every year. I think myself, I noticed, I think that sort of machine field force during campaigns in Chicago is slowly, I think it's aging out and diminishing, and it's being replaced by a reliance on union money and corporate donors. I think raising funds at the aldermanic level, fundraising is more important than ever. I know many candidates who essentially spent more than half of their day making calls, raising funds. And I guess the last observation is, it didn't take long for the national media to zero in on Chicago as a battle for the soul of the Democratic Party. So you saw a lot of that. But I think the last point I'll make is that at the mayoral level and even at the aldermanic level, I think a lot of the voting came down to style versus substance. I think voters saw the message from Mayor Emanuel, and just like you might see like the Downy fabric softener that's kinder, gentler, softer on your skin, I think that's the expectation among a lot of voters, is that Mayor Emanuel is great for Chicago, and while he can rub people the wrong way, we're willing to give him that second chance.
Thank you, Jim. Everybody, a mentor of mine, and that's very least of his accomplishments. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Green.
That's okay. I've been applauded less. Don't worry. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the introduction. 4 quick points. You could have 3 bites of food, and I'll be done. Number 1. April 7th was basically a replay of February 24th. A couple of minor changes, but the results were pretty much the same, and the notion that somehow there was going to be a revamp, sorry Jackie, of the Washington Coalition, there was no chance of that happening. I wrote about it in the Sun-Times, and the results bear that. So when I'm right, I always mention it. Number 2, I still think Rahm Emanuel had problems with his so-called field organization. I think it just simply may be changing demographics, but the turnout in his strongest wards was terrible. He should have won by a lot more votes because he was getting 80% of the vote in some wards, and their turnout was below the halfway mark. So that is something that he's going to have to worry about if he wants to go for a 3rd term. Number 3, the biggest surprise for me in this on the April 7th was what happened in the 19th and 41st wards. Traditionally, going back a few years, I go back a lot of years, those were, when there used to be a Democratic machine, those used to be the picture-perfect wards. That has changed, but a lot of policemen, a lot of firemen there, a lot of anger at Emanuel, and they came in pretty strong for him. I think that was a surprise for me. And last but not least, and with no disrespect to any of the people here, many of the issues that were raised by Mr. Garcia, who, by the way, is an incredible gentleman. We had him at the City Club, and he is absolutely a decent fellow. But all these kind of side issues just simply aren't what's really affecting Chicago. And I know a lot of you are really interested in redistricting and an elected school board, which I'm against unless I can draw the map. Usually I get a bigger round of applause.
Yeah, I don't know what to say.
But the reality is our fiscal condition trumps everything that has been said in the campaign. The bonds, the ratings, the debt, the deficit, the pensions. That's the issue. Those are the issues that have to be addressed. Those are the issues that neither candidate really wanted to discuss, because those are the issues that are going to tick some people off. And I think you just simply gently coat your positions, which they did. And last but not least, the one good thing for Mr. Garcia, on Wednesday, he didn't have to appoint a commission.
Thank you very much, Paul. Next up, research analyst, Illinois election data, Scott Kennedy.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to talk about who I thought was the biggest winner in this election cycle, and that, without a doubt, was Jim and his team at Aldertrack. I thought they just did a tremendous job. They were welcome newcomers on the scene. They provided us with a lot of information that we probably otherwise wouldn't have access to. And then I thought, because they did such a good job with so many different elements, I think they provided a roadmap. I thought that this election was covered the best that we've seen. I thought it had the most information available. I thought that information was presented well. And I thought they really led the way and allowed other people to see some good strategies for how to cover the race. I know for a fact that they didn't make money doing what they're doing, and now they're trying to put a long-term plan together so that they can do this work for a very long time. I think if we're at all considering subscribing to AlderTrack, I think they've done everything they could possibly do to prove that they're worth the value. So I'm hopeful that their business model works. I'm hopeful that they stay around for a long time because I was really pleased with the output. The one thing I want to talk about really briefly at the beginning, one of the main themes in this race, particularly for the Garcia campaign, was the idea that there were two Chicago. One that the mayor was focused on that was more affluent than less, more white than less, more downtown focused than less, not necessarily people who live downtown, but the people who work downtown. And then that there was this other subset of voters, more in the neighborhoods, less affluent, larger minority communities. And so I was interested to see if we could identify that within the data. And it turns out when you overlay census data on top of the vote totals, and you were looking at mean income, areas where the mean income was about $60,000 or less made up about half of the electorate, of the people that voted. Areas where the mean income was $60,000 or more made up about half of that, the other half of that vote. In the areas where, in these areas, the areas under $60,000, areas that had predominantly African-American majority voters lived, about 83% of them lived in areas under $60,000 and only about 17% above $60,000. Same thing with Hispanics. These areas were primarily African-American and Hispanic. Conversely, areas that had white majorities, only about 6% of them lived in areas where the mean income was under $60,000. So I thought this was a really good definition if you were looking at vote totals based on this sort of narrative. In the areas above $60,000, where the mean income was above $60,000, Mayor Emanuel won that 62-38. This was very clear, strong vote totals for him. That was the area where he did best. And I was looking and expecting to see in the lower income area that the Garcia campaign was more effective because they were certainly campaigning and that was their focus. And here they had a slight majority. The Garcia campaign outperformed Mayor Emanuel 51-49. And if Chuy Garcia was going to be effective and that campaign was going to work, that number needed to be bigger. So even though that was the narrative, I don't think that the vote totals sort of bore that out. And I think the fact that some of the people in the communities and the neighborhoods that the Garcia campaign was focusing on stayed in the Emanuel camp, and I think that was a key component to why Tuesday ended the way it did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott Kennedy. Next up, SHARI Runner, Senior Vice President, Strategy and Community Development at the Chicago Urban League. Clap, clap, clap. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'm just going to make a couple quick points that I think it's very interesting. A lot of the headlines that were released the day after the election talked about Rahm Emanuel's win being attributable to the African American community. And while I think that his ability to hold on to his vote there is real, it also is real that the African American community did not vote as a monolith. There were African Americans on both sides of this election and people who decided that they could not continue to see what's been historically done in the neighborhoods continue. So there was a strong amount of support for Chuy Garcia as well. It wasn't an overwhelmingly 80 or 90% African American vote for the traditional candidate, in other words. I think that some of the issues, some of the things that some of my panelists, my co-panelists have said about what were the issues, I think in the African American communities, the top issues are crime, jobs, and education, and how are we going to move forward with that? What is going to be the impact now that the mayor's won re-election? What is the impact of having been a prime supporter of the mayor? What will we do now that he ostensibly owes the communities something, and how will we work to make sure that that happens as we move forward? I also think that the other issue that is being looked at nationally and that we have to think about in the city of Chicago is what is the impact of large amounts of money? We're looking at a lot of national races that are being dominated by people who have huge amounts of money. And what did that mean in the city of Chicago? And how is that going to change? How is this election going to change the landscape nationally and locally as we move forward to have grassroots organizations have a bigger impact and a louder voice in our elections?
Thank you very much, Sherry Runner. And now Jorge Sanchez, senior litigator for MALDEF. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Well, I actually think that one of the big winners is the Latino community. I think that one of the things that this election showed is that if you have a good, credible candidate that has deep ties to the community will turn out and support that candidate. It's also very interesting that this support materialized even in the absence of support by the Latino city council members. And so to the extent that they could have put more resources, or whether they put more resources into the race or not, Garcia handily won most of the predominantly Latino wards. I also think it's very interesting is I think that our city is a winner here. I think that we've seen competitive races throughout the city. I actually spent a good part of election day down in the 10th ward, which is where I grew up, and I was literally all the way down in the corner by Hegwish, where there's a polling place on Fox Lake that's a hunting club that apparently is the only place you can hunt in the city of Chicago, and as well as into South Chicago. And there's a precinct actually in Jeffrey Manor, which is where I grew up, which is a predominantly African American precinct. And it was interesting to look at this race because Garcia handily won this ward by 60%, but the aldermanic race is razor thin still now. Sadlowski Garza has the larger number of votes, but I think what's interesting about that is that there is an increasing amount of independence, not just among the Latino community, but also I think among white ethnics, and wards that were predominantly controlled, or there's about 3 wards that have white aldermen that are Latino voting age majorities. That's the 14th, the 10th, which now might have turned, and the 33rd, and all of those wards went for Garcia. I think that there's a possibility that there will be consequences for incumbent aldermen as the next race rolls around, where people start to feel that their elected representatives might not have been doing the best job of representing them. And in fact, there were a couple of incumbent Latino aldermen who lost their seats, Ray Suarez and Ray Colon in the primaries. That's all I have to say.
Terrific. All right, now back to Dick Simpson. Let's go over to Dick Simpson, Professor of Political Science, UIC.
I can't see you from sitting down, so I'll stand up. I want to make 5 points I learned from my mentor there, Paul Green. The first point is turnout was very decisive. In the city, it was roughly 40%. In the suburbs, it was abysmally bad at 14%, and a large number of the suburbs do not have contested elections. They've sworn off elections. They think just continued dictatorship is a good thing in the majority of the suburbs, and they're usually held out as the wonderful part of democracy. I'm beginning to think it's not true. In our book, Corrupt Illinois, we found 60 suburbs, 200 suburban officials had gone to jail for public corruption. So I think some attention to suburbs is necessary, but I'm not going to do it today other than to comment on the turnout. Secondly, this was a racially divided vote. The whites, particularly along the lakefront, as you heard from the statistics earlier, voted strongly for Rahm Emanuel. Latinos voted strongly for Jesus Garcia, and the African American vote stayed with a majority for Rahm Emanuel, but not an overwhelming majority. Third, one of the most important things is the progressive bloc in the city council essentially doubled. It went from 8, with Bob Furietti resigning to run for mayor, so it was at 7. All 7 of those incumbents were re-elected, and they've added something like another 6 members or so, maybe a few more. So we're looking at a doubled size in the progressive bloc in the city council. That means, as my 4th point, that we no longer have quite such a strong rubber stamp in the city council. It means, particularly when we get to the hard choices of raising taxes, cutting services, making difficult decisions in the year ahead, that there isn't an automatic vote. In fact, I expect to see, based on previous city councils, there to be probably a revolt in the city council if Rahm Emanuel proposes, say, doubling or tripling the property tax, or we're in those kinds of situations. And that will be an interesting thing to see play out as the aldermen begin to represent their actual communities and their circumstances, and not simply what the mayor wants. And last of all, the election, it turned on it in the end, who can handle the budget crisis on the mayor's side, the wish that at the community side not to have an alderman who is a rubber stamp, but someone that they think is going to represent them, but is also delivering services. And most of all, I think voters are trying to signal they want some more say in these tough decisions that are coming up in the year ahead. And so there's not a total revolution. It doesn't look, I mean, Rahm Emanuel's still mayor, who still has an overwhelming majority in the city council, but there is a shift, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the elections ahead.
Thank you very much, Dick. And now the man who kept all of the reporters and activists on the edge of their chairs on Sunday afternoons throughout this entire sequence. Ladies and gentlemen, from Ogden and Fry, Tom Swiss.
Thank you. I'm going to go over two types of problems that we see in polling: real problems and perception problems. The first is that if you're pulling marbles out of a bag where the statistics for polling comes from, if you have blue and red marbles, it's real easy. You can be perfect all day. But in Chicago, you have a self-segregating community where you'll have different ethnic groups all around the city. But that's actually an easy problem to solve if you properly randomize your data. Some of the polling firms have had issues with that, but that's actually easy to solve. Now, in this case, there's actually a very real problem that was difficult to solve, and that is disproportionate turnout. Because if you look at the aldermanic races, which drive a lot of the turnout, if there is, like in the municipal election, there was no candidates or no challengers for a variety of the aldermanic candidates. Like in the 42nd Ward, Brendan Riley was unopposed, and the only question was whether or not Emanuel was going to reach 50% plus one. So the turnout there was very low, versus a 45th Ward where John Garrido had only won by 30 votes in the last election. The turnout was really high. So that's actually a nightmare scenario, is because you have a very disproportionate turnout throughout the city, but you just, you do your polling as best you can. Now, one of the things we saw is the Hispanic population tends to underpoll. And we saw in the municipal election, Garcia was lower. Now, I don't think that was entirely due to the fact that the Hispanic population was underpolled, but I also think some of the African American population that was voting for Willie Wilson stayed home. And I think that's what gave part of his pop. We had him around 26%. He came in at 33. So we started our first poll on January 17th, and we ran it for 12 straight weeks. And we ended up doing a total of 19 polls. And we added 2 polls at the end where we would have undecided as well as with undecided, just to see where the undecideds were breaking. The Illinois Observer commissioned a poll the day after the municipal election to see, heads up, how Garcia and Emanuel, we had 42-38. And then we run our weekly poll on Saturdays and came out with the same result. And you could see that it started out as a very tight race. I think there was some anger at Emanuel's leadership style, some anger at the school closings in some of the communities, and a little bit of enthusiasm for Garcia at that point. But then over the weeks, you started seeing that the polling that we did, it started out very consistent and slight movements in it. So what we're able to see is small movements within the margin of error. So you can't actually come to a conclusion. Well, over several weeks, it starts creeping out of the margin of error, and that's where you see Emanuel's negative ads asking the question, how is he going to pay for it? Really pay off. And you started to see what started out as a close race ended up having a significant double-digit margin for Emanuel. So I'm actually very proud also of our final result. Our last poll had Emanuel at 56.6% versus right now he's at 55.7%. and we had Garcia at 43.4, and he's at 44.3. So you really can't get much closer to that. So we're pretty happy about that. One of the questions that we had going into the runoff final is how big was this Hispanic wave that we're hearing a lot of anecdotal evidence about? And it didn't turn out apparently to be that large, or at least Rahm Emanuel, who had a poor get out the vote strategy in the municipal election, got his act together a little bit, maybe not good enough, but he was able to neutralize whatever the increased voter registration and turnout in Hispanic communities were. And then lastly, I'll talk about one of the also problems is just a perception problem of polling, is you can't prove that a poll is correct. So within the media, you start hearing a lot of confusion as to what they mean. And if you have a variety of polling companies, they'll have different methodologies, so their numbers might be a little bit different. So you actually can't really compare that easily different polling companies. And one of the things I'll point out is there's also what I call weaponized polling. There's one firm out there that will go around to any candidate and provide what results they want. It's traditionally known as push polling. And so in the municipal election, this guy came out and said that Fioretti had jumped up into second place. I mean, that was ridiculous, because we had Fioretti in fourth consistently throughout. But he's paid to do that, and that's one of the strategies a campaign might use, is to actually get media attention and try to get enthusiasm for their candidate.
Tom Swiss, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. All right, now now I know we've got a lot of curriculum in here, but I want to ask a quick question right down the line, and why don't we start again with Jim, and we'll just go down. I want to hear a specific comment about the Emanuel campaign, something they did right or something they did wrong, and about Chewy's campaign, Commissioner Garcia's campaign, something that his campaign did right, something that his campaign did not do right. Okay, let's focus in on these campaigns, and let's talk a little bit about the choices they made in the context of the runoff, and whether or not where they met the challenge or they missed the challenge. SHARI, could we have the microphone back over for Jim? And we'll just go right down the line. Just start with Jim and go right down.
Some will say that Jesus Garcia did not have very much time to formulate a specific plan on how he would deal with Chicago's financial situation. But I think that where the campaign went wrong is they had the opportunity to identify these commission members and issue a bunch of white papers. I mean, he had only one opportunity in that first debate to be very specific, and he didn't take it, and I think that that's what hurt him the most.
Anything about the Emanuel campaign? It did well or poorly? Or
I think they raised $20 million really well.
Very good.
I would simply say Ibid. I think he's right. The Garcia became we sponsored the last debate, the City Club, and for the first half hour that was a great debate until we got into child rearing. But the ultimate point was that Emanuel kept pounding him on name somebody, and he wouldn't do it. So it's sort of like the play Oliver. He was reassessing and reviewing, and when you're the challenger, you got to come up with some ideas. As for Emanuel, he kept his friends, and they kept him.
I thought the one thing that I thought the Garcia campaign needed to do going into the runoff was to consolidate a greater concentration of organized labor support. We all know that the teachers were very much for them, and I thought in addition to that, they needed to increase enthusiasm within the Hispanic community, and I thought when they were able to get the SEIU participation, that was going to A, help them coalesce some of that labor anger, and B, they have a specific experience trying to turn out Hispanic voters, which is a traditionally difficult thing to do. So I thought that was a real key component for them in trying to drive what their strategy was. I think at the end, they were able, the numbers will show, and we'll get into some of that later, that they were able to increase that enthusiasm and participation, but just not at the level that they needed to get over the top. I thought for the Emanuel campaign, in a similar vein, the mayor in the February election, he got about a third of Hispanic voters, or at least he got about a third of the voters who live in majority Hispanic areas, which led us to believe he got about a third of that vote. And then I was suspecting that if the Garcia campaign was going to be successful in the runoff, that they were going to steal some of those those supporters.
Win them over.
Sure. Can make a persuasive argument that that would be a better choice. And the mayor held onto that coalition. He was able to retain that level of support in the runoff. And I thought that was a key component to this election.
I think that Commissioner Garcia, his real issue was embracing the specter of Harold Washington, and on both sides. I mean, he did it, and it was an excellent opportunity for him to reignite the Black-Brown coalition in the city and to really bring some discussion together, but I don't really think he followed through on that. I think it started, but it didn't really go all the way. So I think that was a pro and a con for him. I think for the mayor, I think that his brightest moment was taking heed of the need for a runoff election and becoming a kinder, gentler mayor, ostensibly, even if it was just through commercials. I think that it's an important thing that he will have to deal with going forward and that he had to deal with during this election.
Or I gotta say, as Charles Lipson said on the night of the election, once the votes were counted, no more Mr. Nice Guy.
So I think one thing that has not been noticed as closely as it ought to be is that Chuy Garcia had 5,000 workers and 30 different campaign offices and associate offices. The real problem about that going forward is there's no organization to keep all of those 5,000 people together and to move forward on other elections. You know, at the end of Harold Washington's period, there were the Washington organizations in many of the wards, and there were also there was still IBI-IPO was fairly strong, and Harold was planning to take over the Democratic Party. There's no similar plan at foot for the progressive movement. There should be. The second thing, in terms of what was done best with the Emanuel campaign, clearly the commercials hitting on Garcia's not up to handling the budget were the ones that were telling and swung the votes that were necessary to win the runoff.
I too think that the commercials that pointed out that there was no plan from Garcia, while you know, obviously not acknowledging that there was no plan for Emanuel either. Even as bond ratings were slipping, you know, in the days previous to the election, it does show what raising a lot of money is able to do for you. I think that you know, this isn't something that Garcia could have had any effect on, but what he did wrong was not get in the race earlier, in the sense of when you talk about trying to rebuild this coalition, one of the other, although the Washington coalition was a Black-Brown coalition, there was also the Lakefront Liberals, and that vote went very, very, very strongly for Emanuel, especially on the north side. So that was something that I think that only time could have helped, and I'm not certain that it would have. I think that you're pointing out that it was a very racially polarized election. I think that you know, the idea of incompetence around a person of color was sort of always in the background of these ads. And you know, Mr. Garcia has a master's in urban planning. I don't know that Mr. Emanuel has a degree in finance, though he made a lot of money working for a bank for about 3 or 4 years. I once heard his job described as a relationship banker. So this isn't somebody who, and those relationships might very well help, but also when you're paying those people back by kicking, you know, scooping payments down the road, and the beneficiaries of that are people who are investing in these things. I mean, he's rewarding his friends through doing all of this stuff, and I don't expect that to change much, unfortunately.
Tom.
Thanks. I'm going to reiterate the point, but I'd like to add one detail to it, and that is that on these TV ads, Rahm Emanuel had a tremendous financial advantage, and he used it, I thought, very cleverly. And what he did was he asked the question, how will he pay for it? There's a rule of thumb in politics that negative TV ads must be answered with TV ads. Garcia didn't have the money to respond. And it was much the way that Blagojevich did to Topinka. Is he said, what's she thinking? And for the first week, Topinka responded and then ran out of money, and all summer, Blagojevich just, beat her up with that question. And I think that subtle, how will she pay for it, was a very clever way to craft his message, as opposed to saying he doesn't have a message, kind of in a Rahm Emanuel dictatorial style. So I thought that was actually very cleverly done. I think Emanuel has some of the smartest guys in politics helping him and working for him. Now with Garcia, I think he made a mistake in trying to offer a bargain. I thought he came out and said, I'll eliminate the red light cameras. And I think that made probably everyone pause for a second, because most all of us hate those. But it wasn't enough, as it was early pointed out, to overcome the idea that Chicago is in a horrible financial condition.
All right, I think we owe it to ourselves to take one more swipe at this Harold Washington issue. And I say this because I think there are very serious differences between the Harold Washington experience and what happened with Commissioner Garcia. And so I'm going to throw something out there, and anybody can react to it. In the Harold Washington context, Jane Byrne precipitated a challenge in the African American community with various appointments and various steps that she took. And it was clear, I think, to everyone in the city that of the potential list of mayoral challengers, Congressman Harold Washington, then serving in the United States House of Representatives, was pretty high up there and was discussed, and had in fact run for mayor. Okay. And the point that I'm making is that Harold's campaign did not come together on the February prior to the April in which he won. And I don't think that with the Karen Lewis situation here in this round, where it seemed that Karen would be the challenger, but then nature took its course, regrettably, and Karen was sidelined. I'm not sure that there was a known specific, okay, we've gone from Karen, we're going to go to Commissioner Garcia, for instance. Whereas back in 1982, there was no doubt, I happened to be working in Washington in the congressional delegation, there was no doubt in 1982 that Harold spent every day of 1982 thinking about his campaign for mayor, and so having these answered, having all of the positions. Any reaction to that from the panel on the historical differences between these two efforts? Okay. And that's putting aside the 100,000 registered voters, et cetera, et cetera.
Many. We got Jackie out there, and we always agree. The reality is, it's just a pipe dream. It's just ludicrous to suggest that you could recreate the Harold Washington coalition, A, by not knowing what the coalition was, and B, that it could be run by an Hispanic. It can't be done, because Harold Washington's coalition, so overrated, multiracial. You had a huge black population in big numbers coming out overwhelmingly for Harold Washington. The rest of the stuff was basically the stuff that put him over the top. But without that black base coming out with 90%, and especially the Epton race in April of '83, unless they were coming out they were outvoting white wards. In those days, we had a lot of white ethnic wards, and black wards were outvoting him, especially on the South Side, especially Gene Sawyer in the 6th Ward and Stroger in the 8th Ward. They matched any white turnout for Epton, and that was the basis. Without that, the few whites who were 35 or 40% along the lakefront, some Hispanics, would have been irrelevant. So with Garcia trying to make off do the same thing, he did not have the Hispanic manpower in voters to come out with the kind of numbers, the turnout numbers, to make it so that would be the base for his coalition. The base was simply not there. And though I look at today, some of the Hispanic wards did not come out at the bottom like they always do, but there's still not enough. The turnout, the people who vote simply are not there. The most undervoted population in Chicago are Hispanic voters. Until that changes, you're not going to have an Hispanic-led coalition basically take over the city.
Okay. Anybody else want to react? The historical differences between...
I just wanted to add to the point that also the citizenship of, the lack of citizenship of large parts of the Latino population means that there aren't as many votes in many of these wards. If you look at 3 wards that went for Emanuel in or at least two, 80% of the 42nd and 43rd are right downtown, and
Can you get closer to the mic?
I'm sorry, but they're just the reality is that there aren't as many votes out there in wards that are the same total population size.
That's an explanation, but in an election, explanations don't count. Numbers do.
All right, and now, next question. I'm going to throw this out. We want to hear from you in a moment, so please formulate. But what constituency now exists for the steps that Mayor Emanuel will have to take, and Mayor Emanuel will have to take to some extent in concert with the new city council that we see? What are the constituencies? We've talked about racial constituencies, we've talked about some ideological, we've talked about unions. What constituencies are going to be on Mayor Emanuel's call list to generate support for the steps that he has to take relative to Chicago's issues?
Well, there's going to have to be an agreement between Rahm Emanuel and the strong white vote and the progressive aldermen that are in the city council. They're going to have to find, look, what we're going to be facing is increased taxes, cut services, and a lot of pain. And there are other things we could do that could offset that, solving the crime problem, solving the school problem, and so forth. But you're going to have to find a ground in which progressives can say, yes, we will allow for this much property tax increase and this much cut services, as long as it's fair, as long as our neighborhoods are going to have a voice in what's actually done. And it'll be interesting to see, can they come together that way? Can Rahm Emanuel being hard-headed and wanting to make the numbers work, fine. We all need to fight in Springfield. There are three key decisions to be made in Springfield that aren't going to be made in City Hall. The first one is whether or not they will back off the $550 million pension payment in 1 year. There's no reason for it. It's like the fiscal cliff in Washington. It's a made-up thing. Yes, we need to make more in pension payments, but we don't have to make an extra $550. The legislature needs to change that. The second thing is Bruce Rauner needs to not make the cut to the local governments as bad as it is in the budget proposal. And we're going to need some flexibility in solving the pension problems depending on what the Supreme Court decision is. And that's a fight we can all be in favor of. That helps all of us. It doesn't matter whether you're the most conservative or the most radical left. We need those three concessions, and we need a unified lobbying effort in Springfield to get them for the city. And that's where you could begin to build a common ground if it starts early, instead of waiting until we have draconian cuts and then everybody's at each other's throat.
Next.
I do think that the interaction and the relationship between Governor Quinn and Mayor Emanuel over the last 4 years, one, it wasn't very interesting. You couldn't penetrate into what was really going on in many instances. There was a lot of finger pointing, of course, but what I think will be interesting is, Governor Quinn had a very distinct style, and as does Mayor Emanuel, and now Governor Rauner comes along and is already right out of the gate, on another campaign in the suburbs, in the city, to talk about cuts, to talk about the corrupt state Supreme Court system. And so it's going to be really interesting, as all of these things need to get done in both City Council and in Springfield. We now have really, for the first time, to see this, the Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Governor Rauner interaction, and I'd be interested to see what other panelists think about that too.
Thank you, Jim. Any other reactions to the constituencies for the changes that seem inevitable and inevitably coming? All right, so let me put it to you this way. Did Mayor Emanuel, as a product of this campaign, establish a predicate or a political basis for what he needs to do? Can you establish a political predicate by asking a question, how is he going to pay for it? What does that do in terms of establishing a basis, not just for him intellectually, but politically to get something done in the city council?
I'll take the political subject. You can keep the predicate.
That's one of these Paul things, I know.
Nobody wants to pay.
Fine.
Nobody
Okay.
wants to pay. So whatever he does, that's why, the iceberg was just not part of the voyage. His campaign was about breakfast the following morning. What you have in effect is that the hard decision, Dick's absolutely right, hard decisions are going to be made and no one's going to be for it. It's going to take all of Emmanuel's strength to try and figure out how to deal with this issue because it's getting worse. It's getting much worse. And I think the critical point is going to be, and I think the flashpoint will be when we had Jesse Sharkey on the GN on election night making new demands from, squeezing water out of a rock. Where are the schools going to come in? Are they going to be demanding more and more when there's nothing left? I just see real hard times ahead, and I don't think there's any political coalition there that's willing to put up with more taxes, cuts in service. And I'll just conclude, we've had a lot of people protesting tax increases. I've never heard of people protesting service increases.
Right. All right, SHARI?
I would say that Rahm Emanuel's probably going to have to use his skills as a relationship banker very hard in the next 4 years to make sure that this works. I think that one of the biggest issues that, as you just said, is that shared pain is not on anybody's agenda right now, and he's going to have to find a way to make that attractive to all of us. And I don't think that he can follow the Rauner model. I know that they're both ex-investment bankers, and I know that the way that public service is done is around making sure that you are aware of the issues that face your constituents. And business is not done that way. Business is done in a way where you cut expenses until it hurts, and business can survive that way, but communities cannot. So it's going to be a shared coalition.
All right, let's get to the impact of turnout. Now, several of you had prepared some comments on the impact of turnout that are different from the earlier perspectives on the race itself. Jorge Sanchez, any reflections on the turnout impact?
Well, clearly,
You need that microphone again, yeah.
Clearly, turnout made a difference. I think that most of what's been said about turnout are things that I agree with. I wasn't aware.
Well, let me get back to the Paul Green referred to this the base in the African American wards, where not only had Harold demanded 100,000 new registered voters, real voters, okay, real people who were really registered, okay, so that increased the voting roll, but then he wanted to get 95% of those people to turn out, and he wanted 95 or 98% of those people to vote for Harold Washington. Now, what's the status of an effort like that, say, in Hispanic-dominated wards, which Paul refers to as a political scientist as the most undervoted wards?
It's still not happening. Certainly, Latinos turn out at rates. I think the only community that might turn out at lower rates is the Asian American community. It needs a lot of work. I think that having attractive candidates, I think that in places where there were competitive aldermanic races, turnout was higher. In places where there wasn't, it was abysmal. It really was. My colleagues were in different parts of the city, and we were talking at various points, just talking about the numbers we were seeing at precincts. And there were precincts on the south side that were 3 times the number of the precincts on, let's say, Westtown Humboldt Park area. So.
All right. Scott Kennedy, did you want to make any observations about turnout and its impact?
Sure. So we saw between the February election and the April election, there were about 20,000 new registered voters, and that varied out throughout the city. Every single ward in the city saw an increase in registration, some as low as about 175 voters, some as high as about 700 voters. I was expecting that if the Garcia campaign was going to be successful, that we were going to see this uptick in participation among the communities most likely to support him, specifically in the Hispanic areas. And we saw an increase in registration disproportionately heavy in the areas you would more likely expect to see the mayor, 42, 43, 1, 32. So there, going into election day, I wasn't seeing sort of that undercurrent that I thought would need to be there for the Garcia campaign. So far, we've got about 96,000 more votes in April than we had in February. And if you were to look at this at a precinct level based on census data, and you broke it down by the ethnicities, the largest percentage increase was actually within the Hispanic community. The second largest increase was within the white community. The African Americans there was an increase in that area versus February, but it just wasn't as large as whites and Hispanics. But when you look at the raw votes, there were about 41,000 or 40,000 new voters in majority white areas, but there were only about 25,000 new voters in majority Hispanic areas. So even though Hispanics increased as a percentage greater than the other subsets, that universe just wasn't large enough to be a difference maker. And so we went from about 34% turnout in February up to about 40, which actually surprised me. I was not expecting, I was in the minority of people who didn't think that turnout would overly increase, and it did, and I was wrong. But to the extent that it did, it was disproportionately among communities that were more likely to support the mayor. And that's why that increase in enthusiasm, it just wasn't as strong as Garcia needed to be successful.
Terrific. SHARI, Runner, any observations on turnout?
I think that it's really important to also note that specifically within African American communities, there's been a proportionate decline in the population. So that is something that needs to be addressed also, or thought about with regard to how powerful a voting bloc the African American community will or could be over the long run versus when Harold Washington was mayor. There is a certain amount of disaffection in the African American community because they know that whoever gets, historically, whoever has been elected mayor spends most of the money, time, and resources on downtown and lakefront, not in the communities. And I think that suppresses voters. They just don't think that it matters, and there has to be someone or something that is going to get them re-engaged. And I think that that particular fact over the long run will continue to hurt the city. I mean, I think the city generally, you cannot look at a 40% turnout of eligible voters and say that that's a good thing for our city. There must be something that changes that, or else we end up with the same kind of politics that we've had for the last 20, 30 years.
Thank you. Tom Swiss, any observations on election runoff, the data projections? You got into some of that, but are there bigger observations?
Yes. When you're running a poll, you're striving for two things, to be accurate and precise. And the difference is, if you look at a bullseye, accurate is how close you are to the center of the bullseye, and precise is how tightly grouped you are. So you're shooting 4 arrows, and if they're tightly bunched, you're very precise. And I think we were able to see that because we ran weekly polling, and I don't know if many elections in the past you've actually seen weekly polls. And when we did that, the guys at AlderTrack actually did a fantastic job making a visual chart. And you could see in the February election where we had Doc Walls at 3.3%. These guys didn't vary much week to week. And what's also interesting is that each candidate had about twice the percentage as the next candidate. That just worked out that way. Where Doc Walls was around 3.3%, Fioretti 6.8%, Willie Wilson 15.2%, Garcia at 26%, and Rahm Emanuel at 48%. But my point is that when it's charted out on a week-to-week basis, you could see those lines very steady, and I think that shows the precision. And then your last poll will show you what the accuracy is. One of the questions I had is when I was running these weekly polls, the numbers were so close, I thought maybe I made a mistake and I'm actually calling the exact same people. And getting the same results. But then I went back and I verified. Normally I will load 15,000 numbers into from my database, and of that you usually get about 25% will live answer, sometimes a little bit lower, but right around that. And of those that live answer, 20 to 24% will actually answer a poll. We just see some slight variations. We do have problems with like the hipsters in Bucktown and the yuppies in Lincoln Park. They don't want to take polls. But when I compared list to list, I had about 350 to 400 of the same list. And so out of those, the number of live answers would be only a quarter of that, and the number to take the poll. My point being is that you would only have in a poll of about 900 to 1,000 respondents, somewhere between 10 and 20 that would overlap from the previous poll, which is exactly what you would want if you randomize the data. So I think we found by running weekly polls, you can demonstrate precision, especially by looking at the charts. And then the last thing also to look at for the data projections is whether or not you're going to be accurate is the crosstabs. When you randomize your data, just make sure the male-female ratio is appropriate to what you'll see on election day. So you normally see more women vote than men. So you see that, we did a lot of aldermanic races, and those actually can be a little bit all over, especially with unknown candidates. You get a very high degree of undecided voters. But like there you'll see a flip in Boys Town, which is to be expected. You'll see the males higher than females. Age is you want to see it skewed to the right, where you'll have the 18 to 30s at the lowest and all the way up to the elderly that generally vote. The older you get, generally the higher propensity you have to vote. And then as well as you want like a geo data, or what I use is zip code to make sure it's proportional to the city. Or I use zip codes for the aldermanic races, and I use wards for the mayoral. And you want to look to make sure that the distribution of the 50 wards is evenly distributed, as well as representing, like what's mentioned is the Hispanic population, which makes up about 28% of the city, actually only represents about 15% of the vote. So you'll see a drop off in like Munoz's ward in the 22nd ward. You'll see about a third or less than half is some of the other wards.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you one quick follow-up, Tom. Can you answer the question of first of all, you do live interviews?
No, it's auto dialer.
These are auto dialer. And how do you account for the difference between landline and mobile?
Both are represented.
All right. So you're scouring both lists.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
all right.
They aren't two separate lists.
And is there a significant or a material increase on the mobile side for completion rates? Are the completion rates the same, landline versus mobile?
I don't know. The completion rate. The problem you run with an auto dialer is it's a very complex actually piece of equipment that has 1 second when a call is answered to make the determination if it's a live answer, an answering machine, a fax, what's called operator intercept, the number you have reached. So it's got 1 second to do that. Now when you're calling lists of people, everyone's got a different service provider. So Sprint may not react real well where Verizon and Comcast and AT&T do. So that's where you run into variations. As far as cell phones or landlines, I don't see that problem. In fact, if you stuck only to one or the other, I think your results, if adequately randomized, would be just fine.
Okay. Back on that, let me ask you a general turnout question. Nigeria, and God bless Nigeria, and the Nigerian people in all of their diversity are facing Boko Haram. And they just elected a new president, and they seem headed to a peaceful transition from the last president who lost and to the new president who's a former military guy. Their turnout was higher than ours.
Everybody's turnout is higher.
What is it? And I used to face questions like this when I was commissioner. But what is it? What can motivate people? I mean, or do we just look up into the blue sky and that's just an imponderable? Is that an imponderable, or is there something that can be done? Audience, I ask you. Yes, Peter.
I think the answer is we've got it too good in this country.
Okay, guy behind Peter.
Warmer weather.
Okay, next. Who else has an idea about turnout? Jackie?
Do it on the weekends.
Do it on the weekends, okay? or create a national holiday. Gentleman with the blue shirt. Get Panera to sponsor the election. Or maybe Starbucks. They want to get into conversations. All right. I don't know. All right. Questions from the audience. All right. Peter's jumping in again. Go ahead. Step.
Peter Scosi. So, Mr. Sanchez, you mentioned that you were surprised Chuy Garcia didn't get more support from the Latino aldermen in the city council. Who surprised you?
No, I wasn't surprised by that. I was saying that he did very well in wards that were Latino, despite the fact of not having the support of the incumbent alderman in those wards. So they didn't do anything. I mean, he basically certainly had they supported him, he may have gotten more of the vote. But he doubled. In those wards, he pretty much doubled Emmanuel's result. So they aren't much of. I think that they have a lot to fear, actually.
Next question, right? Jackie, go ahead.
My question is, it seemed to me that one of the people that the mayor was running against, in addition to the commissioner, was the former mayor, Mayor Daley. And so my question to the panel is that, do you think that Mayor Daley lost in this election because there was so much of the Emmanuel conversation about the administration, the last administration, or the former administration, or what I inherited, or whatever? And so I just wondered what your thoughts is on the relationship of Mayor Daley to this last campaign.
Well, I found it very surprising how quickly Mayor Daley's image and popularity tanked after he was mayor. If you can remember to what it was like just before his term ended, everybody thought that Daley was the name of the mayor, whoever it was, that would be Rom Daley or, whoever. We'd always had a Daley, 40 years of the last 60 have been a Daley. So I've been very surprised at how quickly his role is eclipsed and how little of public voice he's had. And I think people are very unhappy about things like the parking meters and the finances and lay it to his administration. And so his popularity has plummeted, and Rahm Emanuel has been, in his acceptance speech, thanked Mayor Daley and how much he'd served the city. But he's not got a very popular position right now. Usually when you leave office, you lose a lot of popularity, but this has been an extraordinary drop in popularity. And Rahm Emanuel is still deferential, but no longer cares. It's now the Rahm Emanuel mayoralty and not the Daley mayoralty.
Any other about Daley losing, Paul? Wait, microphone. Yeah, so.
He won 6 elections, most of them with overwhelming landslides. He's had a stroke. I think picking on Mayor Daley right now is not very effective or very productive. And Rahm Emanuel owes an awful lot to Daley, not only for being mayor, but for being congressman from the fighting 5th District.
Well, as a Republican, and there are a couple of Republicans that say, I will say...
They raise their hand.
Rahm's been a lot more gracious. First of all, you don't hear Rahm think gracious, and I never have. I've known the guy for 25 years, or maybe more. Anyway, number 2, he has been gracious. He's been incredibly gracious towards Daley, and he's been 180 degrees away from what he advised Obama to do with respect to, say, President Bush. So, I mean, there is a lot of cognition here about what to say, how to deal with it. But Jackie, facts are stubborn, and they caught up. I think they caught up with the conversation. Gentleman in the green shirt, I know you had a question, and then we're going to the lady. There's the lady with glasses and in the back, and then up to you.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the panelists, of the 5 roughly aldermen runoffs that are very close, how many of them do you think are actually going to be detailed recount? And I understand it's a fact in state funding for the Chicago Board of Elections and will that impact runoff operation?
I spoke with Rich Means, the state's probably best election attorney among them, among them, sorry, and he said that in about a third of the cases, wherever there's a really close election, about a third of the cases, the candidate will explore doing what's known as a discovery recount and back away because they can't, win it. In about a third of the cases, they'll do what's known as a discovery recount, but then not pursue what's known as an election contest. That's the lawsuit that represents a full-blown recount. And then in the other third, the time they'll do the election contest with the circuit court. It's extremely expensive, as you can imagine, to pay the attorneys to do that last option. And I think we're going to know within the next week or so which of those 5 wards, which I can tell you are the 43rd ward, the 10th ward, the 16th ward looks very close. The other 2 look like they're going to be straight out wins.
I think
Don't discount the postman.
Yeah, because they're waiting at the board for absentee ballots that are postmarked by the day of the election. All right, now, wait, the lady with the glasses. Here we are, yes.
So it's a two-part question, actually. Looking at the lower Latino turnout than expected, would it be, do you think, is there any stats showing potentially a lot of Latinos in these districts or in these wards are legal residents who have not naturalized yet? Could that be a potential? And second piece is, do you think that the Latino and other immigrant turnout was lower due to a lot of federal issues impacting the
Jorge.
I think that turnout is bad even when you take out non-citizens. I mean, that's the unfortunate reality. I think that one of the things that does make a difference is having people who are perceived as representing the community. I think that that when you have, it's one of the things that you hear not just from Latinos, but often young people. There's no real choice, right? Why don't you vote? Well, they're all the same. And I think that this election, despite attempts to perhaps portray the candidates as being essentially no different from each other, that couldn't be farther from the truth if you were paying attention. When I heard that, it was sort of frustrating because it does make you think, what are you, how are you not paying attention to understand that at least philosophically these 2 candidates are very different. What they end up doing and what they have to do to fix the finances of the city aren't terribly likely to be very different. But and as far as the immigration thing, I think that definitely the Latino community was playing on very heavily on Rahm's forceful advocacy of deportation when he was in the White House under Clinton, as well as when he was in the White House under Obama. So I think that immigration issues are, one of, if not the principal issue, certainly among the Mexican American community. It may not be quite as so among other, certainly maybe not as much the Puerto Rican community, maybe not as much the Cuban American community, but for just about all other sort of Central and South Americans, it is the issue that is definitely highest in people's minds, and at least in terms of national issues.
Okay, and flash poll for Tom Swiss. Because of conversation in places like Columbia Law School, Harvard, Washington Post, how many people in this room think that it would be more just and equitable in the United States if non-citizens were allowed to vote? Show of hands, how many think it's okay? And how many do not think we should have non-citizens voting? Show of hand. Okay. All right, Tom, did you get that done? I don't know if that's random.
I'm curious about whether people have different opinions, whether you're talking about local school board elections versus congressional or
everybody who has
elections.
a gradation in their sense of this issue, please raise your hand. Okay, some. Okay. Now, the gentleman in the blue shirt with the red tie, I think you're next.
I wanted to ask about cooperation and state funding on 3 topics. Sales tax, potentially gasoline tax, and casino, and because the federal government's come up with the trust fund and the national infrastructure conversation meld together. Do you see anything in the next 6 weeks on Springfield with any revenue sources?
Increasing the gas tax with a channel directly to municipalities, including the city?
Or in any way, shape, or form, the same thing with the sales tax.
Okay. I think we're asked if we want to rewrite the tax code. Okay, anybody want to do it? All right. I will talk about taxes, though. I want to talk about that. We have been, as a regionalist like Peter, I'm pretty hung up on the fact that the region does extend beyond, this could be news to some, it extends beyond the city limit. Okay, so there was an election out in the region, and the friends at the Tribune today gave us a nice little prop. Clean slate wants president out. This is Kathy Hamilton, who is a trustee out the College of DuPage, which is in DuPage and Will and Cook. Now, who here was watching any races? This thing was huge out in DuPage. Over 1 million people. It's the size of 2 congressional districts. It's a big deal out there. But who here was watching any suburban races?
Well, we had Kathy on the radio on election night, and remember that name. She is going to be a player. And that is a big thing. And no, not my usual contempt for university presidents, which is Dick Simpson knows runs pretty deep. No, that is big, and it's amazing. You know, one person can make a difference. She stood up when they were ridiculing her and they were censoring her or whatever they were doing because she was speaking out against what was going on with the College of DuPage, and now it looks like she's going to be in charge. For some of us from the old school, that's just really nice. Really nice. And watch that, because there's an enormous amount of money there. I mean, one last thing. The biggest shock, Dick Simpson can talk about this because he knows at UIC the cafeteria is deluxe. To have a restaurant that is prime time with fine wine, it's just, they live large. I mean, that's all I can tell you. But it's over. By the way, she makes Jane Byrne look tall. And she is just going to go out there, and boy, oh boy, it's going to be fun to watch.
Any other suburban races on anybody's radar screen up here? Hinsdale, U46?
Well, the one I was saying was that in something like 50 or 60% of the races, there was no opponent on the ballot. 63%? And that's just huge.
And that's across the region?
Across the region.
Okay. Wow, 63. We got to get people interested. All right, a couple more before we close.
However, Mayor Kellogg and Harvey, despite bad press, won again.
There you go. All right, in the back, and then we'll come here, and then that might be the last one.
He will not be a weakened mayor, and I hope he doesn't run for a 3rd term.
Nothing personal.
Nothing.
Yeah, I have no personal view on whether or not he will run for a 3rd term, but I do not think he will run for a 3rd term. I don't think that that's his agenda at this point. I think that he won't be a weakened mayor, and he could be a much stronger mayor in his legacy if he actually does reform some of the things that he has promised during this campaign. And if he makes real change, back to your question earlier about how do we increase voter turnout, if people realize that there can be change on a neighborhood level and a community level, then people get interested in what is going on. When there is continued with the same policies and the same outcomes year after year, it kills turnout, and it kills it especially in minority communities.
All right, Sharon, and we had somebody down here. This gentleman here.
Since we've gone to early voting, I think about 2006 was our first time going. Since we've gone to early voting, and now that we have no called absentee mail, if the board releases any information that you guys have seen, have we seen a greater percentage of the vote? I know we've seen a greater percentage of the vote being cast before election day, but is there any kind of measurement that you guys have seen at the rate at which it's increasing, or the rate at which other jurisdictions may have a consistent 30% of the vote or something like that's going to be cast before election day?
Roughly, the early voting has doubled every time we've had early voting, roughly speaking. There were 140,000 votes cast early, not counting the mail ballots, but the early voting ballots. You're going to see that as a continuing trend because people find it more convenient. The campaigns want it because they can lock in their vote earlier. And so I expect to see, it is now a long-term proposition, given the way the laws change. And so we're going to continue to see early voting, and we will continue to see increases in early voting until it becomes a major phenomena. It was, in comparison to the turnout this time, which was only 40%, the early voting had doubled over the voting even in the primary, and the primary was greater than
No
the
primary,
November.
no primary.
Yeah, it wasn't a primary. But Dick, on the other issue, on the question of greater access, do you find numbers that indicate that the expansion of these voting options, such as the no-fault absentee, such as early, has increased turnout overall?
The number of people registered to vote has gone up. The turnout has not. So there are more people eligible to vote, and more people are voting, but the turnout rate is not going up.
Thank you. All right, now Jim, and then Paul.
Just a quick note that this will be the last municipal election that does not have what's known as same-day registration. So going forward on election day, if you're not registered, you can still show up and vote.
You can cast a ballot. Whether or not that becomes a vote is subject to an inquiry after the day of the election. I'm just sounding like an old commissioner, I know. Sorry. I'll tell you the difference in tabulation and counting. Go ahead.
Since this has been such a congenial, happy, everyone getting along, why don't we just end it with a little, anger?
We got one.
Not that I would ever try to produce that. One of the reasons the turnout is down, not the only reason, but one of the reasons, is that and Dick Simpson had a lot to do with this, is the destruction of ward organizations. Total destruction. The people still use the word machine, and they're talking about a horse and buggy now. The reality is, if you were a good ward committeeman in the good old days, did Jackie leave?
No, Jackie's
all right, Jackie, you know this. If you were a good ward committeeman in the good old days, you wanted your eligible voter list to be clean.
Right.
The notion of, padding voters and so forth and so on, because when you had to face Richard J. Daley, as all ward committeemen had to do, mano mano, and your turnout was down, the one thing you didn't want to have is to have people who were dead, who moved out, hurting your percentages. Right. There isn't of that anymore. I'm sure if you had to cleanse these voting lists, there might be a lot of people don't exist anymore, so that drives down the turnout percentage. And I think that's one of the things that's there, and that's one of the prices you pay for greater democracy.
We had, this young lady here was going to ask a question, and that might be our parting shot.
I don't know if it's worth spending the time on it, but I just wanted to throw out there, I was wondering about the correlation with there being so few people who ran in the suburbs, particularly this time, and what seems to be an abnormally high amount of write-in votes. And I just wanted to know what the percentages of that were. I don't even have that now, but maybe you want to do a last question.
Yeah, let's think about a last question here. Peter wants to. Okay, go ahead, Peter. This is bring us together, man. Come on.
So personally, I abhor the term progressive alderman. I don't think it categorizes or accurately conveys who these folks are. If indeed the 8 folks in city council are to be termed progressive, a few of them got that label simply by saying no, and that would indicate that our members of Congress are the most progressive group on earth. So perhaps the panel could come up with a new term for progressive.
Okay, we're getting a lot of admonitions here at the end. We're not
cowardly liberals.
All right. Well, you know that's going to be Paul Green, and you're going to thank him in a moment. Hold your applause. Jim Dispenza, Scott Kennedy, Sherry Runner, Jorge Sanchez, Dick Simpson, and Tom Swiss, and even our 7.5 panelist, Peter Scozzi. How about a round of applause thanking him?